Let me share my screen. You can see that. Terima kasih banyak dan selamat pagi semua dari Melbourne, Australia. It is a great pleasure and an honour to be able to connect with you all today on this important topic of judicial wellbeing. I want to acknowledge at the outset that this is a sensitive topic, and until very recently, it was taboo in judicial culture worldwide, I think, to talk about judicial stress. So please, let's go gently this morning and look after ourselves and each other in this conversation. In the 20 minutes that I have, I would like to address three broad topics. That is, what is judicial wellbeing and why is it important? What we know about judicial stress, principally from my research in Australia, and then responding to judicial stress, sharing some principles and strategies. Each of these is a vast topic that I could spend more than a day speaking on, but in this short presentation, I want to highlight some key ideas that will hopefully provide a springboard for discussion that will follow. So firstly, what is judicial wellbeing and why is it important? Well, before we get to talk about judicial stress and wellbeing, let's talk a bit about stress and wellbeing more generally. It was the Honourable Michael Kirby, formerly of the High Court of Australia, and in fact, Australia's first voice on the topic of judicial stress back in the 1990s, who said, judicial stress is just one form of stress in human beings. So by that, he meant judges are human and subject to the full range of human emotion and experience. We shouldn't be placing superhuman expectations on ourselves. We know from psychology that human well-being exists on a dynamic continuum, and we move up and down this continuum many times over the course of our lives, and sometimes even over the course of a single day. We strive to spend most of our time around here, and when things are more or less in balance in our lives, we will spend most of our time there. There are strategies and practices that can support this state of mind, but that's not to say that it is any sort of personal failing to find ourselves in these less pleasant zones. Surviving, struggling, even being in crisis are also natural human reactions under certain circumstances. What we hope to do is understand how stress works, what the early warning signs are, so that we can recognise when we're sliding down the continuum and we can take action. So that's well-being. What is stress? Well, it might surprise you, as it did me, to learn that the term stress, in English anyway, was first applied to human beings as recently as 1964. This researcher by the name of Hans Selye was the first person to use this term, and he defined stress as the non-specific response of the body to any demand, whether positive or negative, made of it. So the important take-home here is that stress is the response. It's the psychological, physical, behavioural response that we can have to external demands. And these external demands we call stressors. Just briefly to highlight what some of the common warning signs of stress are. So there are physical warning signs, including shallow breathing, increased heart rate, sweating, feeling very tired or struggling to sleep. There are behavioural warning signs, wanting to avoid interacting with people, wanting to avoid certain cases, certain work, certain places, feeling irritable or easily angered, and having difficulty separating work from home. And then there are psychological warning signs. So increased emotional reactivity, which means we become more emotionally responsive over perhaps small things that wouldn't normally bother us, or emotional numbness, feeling cut off from our emotions. And then at the more extreme end, we can start re-experiencing or reimagining stories of trauma that we might have heard about in our work, which can have the effect to change some of our core beliefs about safety in the world, our core beliefs about ourselves and about others. More recently, researchers in psychology of stress have discovered through literally dozens of experiments that stress is not just the direct response of the body to external demands, but rather it's mediated by how we see the situation. That is, whether we see the demands within our environment as within our ability to cope or outside our ability to cope. When the demands are seen by us or appraised by us as within our resources, then stress can be a challenge, and it's seen as a challenge, and this can be a positive, motivating thing that enhances our well-being. But when the demands are appraised by us as being outside our resources, this is where we can experience stress as a threat to our well-being. So whether the demands of our environment, the demands of our work, are appraised as a challenge, so something positive, or as a threat, something negative. Depends, of course, on the severity of those demands, the context in which we're facing them, the resources we have to support us, but also our own personality and coping style. Talking then about judicial stress. So I think it's interesting to consider the stressors of judicial office that judges over the years have written about, including Justice Michael Kirby, who I mentioned before. I don't propose to go into these lists in any great detail, but suffice to say, when you have very high and increasing workloads, high intensity work that involves distressing subject matter and distressed people, and working in an environment characterized by isolation, intense scrutiny, a stigmatization of stress, and limited supportive feedback, you do have in psychological terms a cocktail of risk factors for occupational stress. And I think it's very important to remember that judicial work is incredibly demanding. Not many people could do what you do every day. And so it's only natural that judges will find themselves impacted from time to time. Why is judicial wellbeing important? Well, I think it's important for three reasons. I think it's important, of course, for individual judicial officers, because we know that stress undermines the psychological and physical health of the person experiencing it. But I also think it's important for court users, so litigants, legal professionals, court staff, because we know that stress undermines our capacities for emotion regulation, so to be able to manage our emotions, and also impulse control, making it more likely that we will behave in ways that we later regret, including on the bench. And I think it's also important potentially for the integrity of judicial decisions, because we know that stress undermines our objectivity and critical thinking, leading potentially to decisions that are more infused with stereotype, more conservative decisions, or decisions that preserve the status quo. And just to illustrate this point, there was a very interesting study, it's now almost 15 years old, coming out of Israel, looking at parole decision makers' decisions. And what they looked at was whether parole was granted or refused, and at what point in the day the decision was made. And what they found was that parole was significantly more likely to be granted at the start of the day, after morning tea and after lunch. And then as the decision makers became fatigued, became stressed by the decisions they were making, by the emotional toll of it, they became predictably more likely to make the conservative and status quo decision of denying parole. So we know that these factors that have been observed in human decision-making generally can and do affect decision makers in the judicial context as well. So what do we know about judicial stress? I'm going to share with you some of the headline findings coming out of my doctoral research that I have conducted in Australia through the University of Melbourne. In my study, there were 5 Australian courts from the lowest level right up to the appellate level. 152 judges participated in a survey and 60 went on to participate in interviews. And I was really seeking to answer 4 questions, because this was the first study of judicial stress ever to be conducted in Australia and one of the first to be conducted worldwide. I wanted to know, are judicial officers stressed? We know that lawyers are, but we didn't have any data on judges. Which judicial officers are most stressed and why? What are the sources and impacts of judicial stress? And also, how could courts respond? So there was a lot of data, as you might imagine, just to give you some of the headline findings. In answer to this first question, it seems that, yes, judicial officers are stressed, but not as much as practicing lawyers. I'm going to share with you some of the findings. So this was a measure of non-specific psychological distress, which is really just a fancy term for general stress. And what we've got up here is judges' scores on this scale, followed by barristers, solicitors, law students, and the general population. So you can see that judges' levels of distress were elevated compared to barristers and the general population in this sort of moderate to high range, but lower than solicitors and law students. I also measured other things like burnout and found that 20% of judges were scoring above the cutoff for burnout. I also measured secondary traumatic stress, which is a pathway to PTSD that I'm sure you've heard about, post-traumatic stress disorder, and found staggeringly that 30% of judges were scoring above the cutoff suggestive of possible PTSD. Also, 30% of judges were scoring in the range suggestive of problematic alcohol consumption, which was considerably higher than the Australian general population of about 19%. Interestingly, though, when it came to symptoms of mental health, so depression and anxiety, judges' scores are in red here. This is depression, anxiety, and clinically significant stress. Judges' scores were significantly lower than the legal profession in purple, and even a little bit lower than the general population. So what this suggested to me was that there is a stress problem within the judiciary, and that burnout, secondary trauma, and problematic alcohol use appear to be occupational hazards of psychological office. However, this stress problem isn't so far manifesting as a widespread mental health problem in the way that it is with the legal profession. The second question was, which judicial officers are most stressed and why? And this is where I was looking at different groups of judicial officers to see which demographic factors were associated with stress levels. What we found was that it was certain courts that were more stressed than others, rather than certain groups of judges or certain practice areas. So I was looking at whether any of these factors were associated with stress levels. And what I found was that there was no relationship between age and levels of stress, even gender and levels of stress, which I was a bit surprised because some studies coming out of America and elsewhere have found that female judges experience higher levels of stress than male judges, but that wasn't what I found. Seniority, so how long a judge had been on the bench, also didn't impact their stress levels, which again was a surprise. Area of legal practice was also not associated with stress levels. So judges sitting in crime were no more or less stressed than those sitting in commercial or civil matters. Also, geographical location wasn't associated with stress. The only demographic variable that had any statistical relationship with levels of stress was jurisdiction. That is, which court within the court hierarchy a judge was sitting. And in Australia, it was very clearly judges in the high volume lower courts. In Australia, we refer to them as magistrates that experienced much higher levels of stress than judges in the trial and appellate courts. So again, what this says is that it's certain kind of courts rather than certain groups of judges or certain practice areas that experience the most stress. And I was also able to demonstrate that it was the courts where judges experience higher levels of relatedness. So that's like a collegial connection and belonging amongst colleagues, and also higher levels of autonomy. So a feeling of control over the way in which they go about their work. They were the courts where judges experience higher overall well-being. The third question, what are the sources and impacts of judicial stress? So this is really where I was looking to what I heard from judges in the interviews. So 60 judges participated in interviews, and I was asking them, where do you think the stress comes from in your work and how does it affect you? The number one issue for pretty much every single judge or magistrate that I spoke to was workload. Pretty much everyone described their workload as relentless, oppressive and crushing. Almost nobody described their workload as sustainable or about right. It was also very clear that it was stress was associated with feelings of injustice, either the perception that one is presiding over an imperfect justice experience for those in the courtroom, or where the demands of the job are coupled with personal feelings of unfairness and personal sort of feelings of unfairness or grievance within the court as a workplace that was most associated with stress in the minds of judges, less so the actual tasks of judging themselves. It was also very clear that a cultural stigmatization of stress, which leads to isolation in the role, exacerbated feelings of stress as well. And I thought I would just share with you one quote from a male trial judge who's sitting in civil that speaks to this point. He said, he was telling about a time in his work where he felt very overwhelmed, and he said, "The only person I've said this to apart from you is my wife. I've not said it to any of my peers here, and I wouldn't because I've got a sense of pride. And I'm not going to admit that it was defeating me, but it was." You can't go and tell someone I'm running red hot and I've run out of steam and I'm at breaking point. You can't. You don't want your next door neighbor or someone else to find out. So you just sort of go on and you start to grind down and become less effective. And I mean, I lived in a little bit of a fog for those 2 years that I hated this job. And I don't use the word hate carelessly. It's a small h hate, but I started to hate it for what it had turned me into and how I was. In fact, I think my hate was probably more that I didn't know how to cope with it. I didn't know how to work it within the broader framework of my life. So hating the job is probably not the correct way of putting it. It was rather more hating, how do I handle all of this? So these were the kinds of experiences that judges were talking about. And I think that the stigma point was big because when people were struggling, they felt they couldn't share it with anyone, and that compounded the difficulties many times. And when people talked about the impact of this, they talked about the impact on their physical health, the impact on their patients in the courtroom, feeling very exhausted and at times feeling like their work didn't feel meaningful to them anymore. Although I've spoken about my study in Australia, I do just want to highlight that there have been a number of other studies that have been conducted since. This is a large-scale study from America where all judges were invited to participate. And then the UNODC also recently did a global study of judicial wellbeing. These studies were very different to mine. They were approached differently. They asked different questions. But to the extent that the data does match the questions that I was asking, these studies the findings are very aligned. I find it really interesting that the research that I've conducted in Australia, when I present it to audiences all over the world, it does seem to resonate. So there seems to be, even though there's many differences in context and culture and circumstance, there seems to be a real commonality of judicial experience worldwide. So in my last few minutes, I just want to briefly highlight some principles for thinking about responding to judicial stress. I think when we want to think about responding to judicial stress, we have to be very clear on what is the stressor that we're hoping to address. Is it something that is intrinsic to the task of judging? So that means, is it something that is absolutely part of being a judge, like making decisions, dealing with people in distress, absorbing difficult subject matter? Or is it something extrinsic, something more within the culture or the environment? And the reason why we want to be clear on this distinction is because the way that we will respond is different. For the intrinsic stressors, they are part of the job. We need to think about how they can be managed. They're not going to go away. But for the extrinsic stressors, those that are more within the context, this is where we can think about how they can be prevented, both at the individual level and the organizational level. What I've found from talking to judges in many countries now is that what really seems to upset judges, and I think this is understandable, is when extrinsic stressors are treated as intrinsic stressors. So this sort of thing. This is just a little cartoon that I found, but you've got Robin here saying, my workload is unmanageable. And Batman slaps him across the face and says, here's a wellbeing seminar. I think this really can annoy people and make them very cynical about psychologists too, because often if we're being told we just have to be more resilient and learn strategies for coping, when the stress is coming from some unreasonable demands in our environment, there's not much that we can do individually to meet that. So the final point here, I guess,
Professor Carly,
yes?
You have 2 minutes left.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So the final point here is that I think the only rational and evidence-based way to think about judicial wellbeing is as both an individual and an organizational responsibility. There are things that individual judges need to do and need to learn about recognizing signs of stress and managing stress, and availing themselves of the kind of supports that courts might make available, like the wonderful things that Chief Justice Olstergren mentioned. But there's also many things that the court as a workplace, as an organisation, needs to do to prevent unnecessary stress. So this model here is a systemic model for judicial wellbeing, something that I've devised based on the work that I've done. And the ideas presented on the right-hand side here are all the kinds of things that courts in Australia are seeking to implement to firstly prevent unnecessary stress that judges face, to help judges manage the irreducible sources of stress in judicial work, because we know that it's not possible to make judicial work stress-free. It is necessarily a highly demanding role, and it will always be that way. And then also strategies for when a judge is impacted, how to support them and help them recover from that impact. So I'm going to leave it there and look forward to talking about this more in the rest of the panel discussion. Thank you so much for having me.